Okay, so hey internet land, it's Kurt here, Ironmonger Racing. I want to do a quick video, talk about this electrical panel. It seems like every time I post pictures of it, I get some questions, specifically about these docks right here. 6 of them along the back side. We've been running this car for 5 years. This is the only way we've ever run the car. Of course, these are docks for Milwaukee batteries. We run 6 Milwaukee batteries in the car. The biggest question I get is, how come we run so many? Well, and I think the reason people ask that is they have seen the Milwaukee batteries in cars before. Usually you'll see one running like, let's say a nitrous bottle blanket heater deal. You'll see one running that. It's kind of a standalone power source for that. So anyway, we don't use them for something like that. We have 6 batteries in there, runs the whole car. It starts the car, runs all the electronics, the ignition box. This year, now we're adding a delay box, it'll run that. Water pump, fuel pump, all of that stuff, runs everything, 6 batteries. The reason we did that was, back in the day, I was helping my brother, and over the course of the day, his voltage just seemed to drop and drop and drop and drop, and wasn't much could be done about it. Just as the rounds we got less and less time between rounds, less and less voltage, started to affect how the car run, yada yada. I started trying to figure out a better way to do things. And I looked at all the different battery options out there. There's some 16 volt stuff out there that a lot of people have a lot of success with. And the thing I didn't like about that solution was those batteries, if you get them in the lithium, the lightweight version, they're pretty darn expensive. I think at the time the battery was like 900 bucks, something like that. And you needed a special charger to go with it. That was 200 or 300 bucks. So, and at the same time, while I'm thinking about this, you know, you got all of these Milwaukee batteries floating around the shop. You know, I use a lot of Milwaukee tools, so batteries everywhere. And I just started thinking, God, why can't you just use these? So originally when we put them in the car and started kind of flushing out some of the problems, one of the things we ran into, at that time we had a fast XFI in the car, and that would throw up a lot of alarms of an over voltage, and it didn't really bother anything, so we just shut those alarms off in the software. MSD box has never had a problem with the higher voltage, and actually an 18 volt battery when fully charged reads more like 20.7, so it's a little bit higher than what you think. The 18 volt, just what they call it, but it's actually like 20.7 when they're fully charged. So these are wired just like you would have in your 2 12 volt batteries. They're wired in parallel, so our voltage is 20.7, and it's the amps that add together the available amperage. Anyway, back to the issues that we ran into when first doing it this way. The electric fan, it would spin the electric fan so fast that the plastic blades of the fan would bend, and they would start to get into the fan shroud. Fuel pumps would run so fast and so hard that you couldn't control them with a fuel pressure regulator, things like that. Water pump ran too fast, so on and so forth. Basically everything ran too fast, all the electric motors, except for the starter. The starter has always loved the extra voltage, and it spins that high compression motor over. Awesome. It's just awesome. It starts it so awesome. Anyway, so this right here is our solution for these electric motors that run too fast. These are just pulse width modulators, and you turn the speed of your electric motor up and down. You know, we've never really had a scientific way to do it. You know what an electric fan's supposed to sound like, and when it sounds like a banshee with its tail being pulled, you turn it down a little bit. You know, so fuel pumps, turn it down till you can regulate the fuel pressure, and you're fine. You know, we didn't get real scientific with that. Everything else pretty much runs as usual. No real issues with anything else. Okay, so we got to cut in a little video here. I forgot to mention a couple of things. Just want to make sure you're aware of everything. So these, I wanted to talk about a couple of drawbacks too, and I kind of forgot to mention them. There's always some gives and takes, right? So I talked about these pulse width modulators to control the speed of the motors. These don't do it through voltage, they do it through a pulse. They basically turn on and off that motor hundreds of times a second, which doesn't matter and you'll never even notice it. But to do this, to use these, you have to run 2 wires to your accessory. You cannot chassis ground the fuel pump or the electric fan or whatever it is. You cannot run a chassis ground. It's an isolated ground. So you run 2 wires to every accessory from your source. So this being our pulse width modulator, for those, we have to run 2 to the fuel pump, to the fan, all of those stuff. So just so you understand that. Same way with these. This is for the ultra chiller and the delay box. I talked to the makers of the delay box, and Biondo sells them, but they're not who makes them. I can't remember. Digital Delay, that's who makes them. Anyway, talked to them, and they did not want to see that box, the delay box electronics run on the 20 volts. So they wanted this in here, one of these or something similar. This is a what do you call it? It's just a voltage reducer. So this will drop it down to 13.8 volts. These do that by basically creating heat. That's where the rest of the voltage goes, out through this case in heat. So these get pretty warm. Same with the ultra chiller, little electric pump. You know, maybe you could do that with one of those, but it's a pretty small amp draw. Both of these are, so not hard to do it with one of these. Yeah, so that's how we did that. Anyway, that's the downside. Same deal with these. It's an isolated ground. This black and yellow wire both go to the delay box. You have to run both of them. No grounding to the chassis. So that's kind of a bummer. That's more wire to run. Another thing to watch out for, we did have an engine fire this past year. We were fighting some issues with the engine, and we needed to, what was it? It was a float sticking or something on one of the carburetors that we had, and we filled the cylinders with fuel. So yeah, knock all the spark plugs out of the holes, and we're gonna crank it over and flush that fuel out of there. And I had disconnected the coil wire off of the coil. Usually that's enough, but there's so much power with this system. It found a spark and it lit it, and it was a pretty good sized ball of flame, kind of scary. Usually it goes out pretty quick. A lot of times fire like that, you can just knock it out with a air blower. You know, it's just the fuel blowing off and burning off. So, but it'll scare the shit out of you, that's for sure, especially when it happens in a confined space and you got fire on the walls and stuff. And yeah, pretty frightening. But anyway, so now the ignition box is wired in on a kill switch. So I can crank the motor over and have the ignition box shut off completely. So there will be no spark, no energy at the coil whatsoever. So that's another thing to watch out for. A lot of power at the coil. And if you have to do something like that, where you need to crank the cylinder clean and get that fuel out of them, it is a pretty big potential for fire. So I guess it would be whether you had this much spark or not, but this does make that worse. So that's just something we ran into. Anyway, I think that's about it. I just wanted to cover a couple other points that I missed. So anyway, we'll get back to the regular video in just a second. Anything else? One thing to be aware of, the ignition box doesn't have a problem with the extra voltage. You're going to have basically 50% more power at the spark plug. And I talked to MSD about this. If you're putting, I don't know what the number is, 1,000, you know, it's way bigger than this obviously, but just for simple math, if you have 1,000 volts coming out of the coil, now it'll be 1,500 volts coming out of the coil. So you got 50% more energy hitting the spark plug. That's kind of nice. You can open up your spark plug gap a little bit. We played around with that this past year. We run methanol, so we always run a little bit tighter gap. Well, I opened the gap up and it did not change a thing. It didn't give us any more horsepower, but we also didn't lose any either. So I think the spark plug gap becomes just a little less critical, not so touchy anyway. Usually methanol likes a little bit crisper spark on a shorter gap. So anyway, that really doesn't seem to be the case with this setup anyhow. So yeah, that's really it, I guess. It's not that hard to wire up. Obviously the big advantage, one of the big advantages of it is we have 6 batteries in the car. There's also 6 batteries in the trailer and they're charged. So when we've tested it and we can do 5 quarter-mile passes. That's starting it, running it up, driving it up through the staging lanes, starting it a couple of times in the staging lanes, burn out, pass, drive back to the pits, maybe even a little bit of cool down in there. We pushed it as far as 5 passes. Any more, we switch out at 3, and everything seems to be really happy that way. At 5 passes, you could tell the batteries were starting to drop. So we just switch them out at 3, and we find that the recharge time is quicker as well. So we kind of keep a happier balance. We're not running them dead and then they take a lot longer to recharge. So 3 passes is a pretty good spot for us and the accessories that we use. We have water pump running all the time. In the past, we've had the fuel pump running all the time, but now we're going to mechanical injection, so that's not an issue anymore. We don't have that. We didn't always run the transmission fan on that cooler. Our tranny fan's in the back with the cooler, so it doesn't get the airflow through it like you would in the front. But so we just would run the fan as needed, and the transmission's never really had a heating issue. It doesn't take long to cool it off when it did, so not a big deal there. So we didn't run a lot of electrical stuff. Recently we added an ultra chiller shirt, another small amp draw. It's not very much. Like I said, this year we're adding a delay box. That's not very many amps. Anyway, it's not really going to change much. We run 5 or 6 of the 5 amp hour batteries in there, so 30 amp hours. So you could do the math and figure it all out. What you can draw. So we could draw 30 amps for an hour or 60 amps for a half hour. That's how that works. The real different part of doing the math on all of that stuff is your starter will draw a lot of amps, 250 amps or whatever, but only for a couple of seconds, hopefully. Hopefully you're not having to crank. So the starter is the only really big draw. Ignition, they say 1 amp for every 1,000 RPM. We're never hitting 75. Well, we might just tickle 7,500 RPM, so 7.5 amps. So not a lot of draw there either. Just not a lot of real big amp draws. And incidentally, when you're running that many volts, your amp draw is proportionately less as well. So if you are 50% more voltage, you're, that much less, not 50% less amperage, like 33% less amperage. So anyway, a third less amperage. So that makes it so you can run a little bit smaller wire. You don't need as many relays, although I like relays. I like to use relays to control things. I like wiring them that way. So that's why I do that. But you can get away with less relays because toggle switches now can handle those amp loads. So just another little advantage there. More voltage, less amperage. So yeah. Anyway, that's pretty much the Milwaukee battery stuff in a nutshell. That's why we do it and how we come up with it. Been running it like this for 5 years, and I really couldn't be happier with it. One of the best things I ever did. Pretty easy to wire up. Do you got any questions? You know where to get a hold of me. Like I said, not hard to wire up. Give it a shot. Do it yourself. Easy to do. I'm not the world's best wiring person. I enjoy it. you know, a lot of guys are really good. They'd have all these wires perfectly straight, and they wouldn't be twisting and flipping on top of each other, and they'd have this all looking super pretty. But you know, that doesn't really gain you nothing. Maybe a little bit easier to trace a wire or something like that, but wiring ain't hard. Take your time, get organized, and do it nice so you can trace wires, and it's not that bad to do. So if you want to get rid of the 40-pound battery that's in your trunk and do something like the Milwaukee batteries, give it a shot. Thanks. Later.